in freedom cannot rest. You believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. You believe in freedom cannot rest. Hear me talking to you. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until the killing of black men, black mother sons, is as important as the killing of white men, white mother sons. You believe in freedom cannot rest. Sing it with me if you like it. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes.
We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. Bernice Johnson Reagan, Sweet Honey in the Rock, the daughter of Georgia. We start with her voice to honor what she brings to the table, what her generation has brought to the table, what those who have come before us bring to this table. My name is Dr. Stephanie Evans, and I am very pleased and honored to be the director of the Institute of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Georgia State University. Thank you for joining us at the Gender Studies in Georgia virtual conference hosted by GSU. This conference commemorates the 25th anniversary of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, also known as WGSS, at Georgia State University, the 50th anniversary of Women's Studies as an academic discipline, and the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. With this event, while this event is an occasion to commemorate three very important historical dates regarding WGSS, our larger purpose focuses on the future of our academic discipline and local, regional, and national community building. And we can think of no better way to build community in Georgia than to amplify the voice of someone like Stacey Abrams, who is active in this state fighting for voting rights. And so I first want to say thank you so much to the department chairs. We actually got together this summer, the department chairs of all the WGSS programs. There were 14 chairs, and we came up with the idea of what we wanted to present as our academic discipline. And although the event was scheduled for March 27th, and we couldn't actually have the event, we did actually purchase a copy of Lead from the Outside, for the leadership of WGSS in the state of Georgia, in which Stacey Abrams writes, "By putting otherness at the center of the conversation, I do not intend to alienate anyone who has claims to privileges, but to draw a clearer map to the skills that have eluded the rest of us for so long." And so she talks about leadership from her position, her very embodiment as a Black woman, and that as as leaders in WGSS is something that we wanted to discuss. What does it mean to be a leader? I also want to take this very quick moment to thank Stacey Keltner and SUSA, the Southeast Women's Studies Association, who is partnering with us, and partner literally, not figuratively, because Stacey, the other Stacey, was the one who created this opportunity to reach such a large audience through the HOP. And so Stacey Keltner did all of the tech. And I want to thank, of course, the teams, our co-sponsors, the Center for the Study of Africa and its Diaspora at GSU, CSAD, and the Department of History as well as the support from the provost and the dean. When we discussed the contours of the gathering, it was apparent that by bringing together a dozen colleges and universities in the state, that we had a unique opportunity to discuss our work in Georgia and to highlight the contribution that feminist critical thinking engenders, pun intended, in this historical moment. This keynote address by Stacey Abrams is flanked by two plenary sessions. One that happened earlier today to celebrate the book, Persistence is Resistance, celebrating 50 years of gender, women, and sexuality studies that is online and open to the public. that was edited by Julie Shane and with contributors Judy Howard and Spelman College's own, the legendary Beverly Guy Sheftall. And the other plenary, held tomorrow at 12 noon, will be Race, Gender, and the Vote. And there were 3 of you who will be winning those books from Celia Hurley's, Onye Carrington, and Janika Lewis were our winners. So each one of the 3 books from the authors of Race, Gender, and the Vote, you will receive that book. And you will also receive Our Time Is Now by Stacey Abrams. In her introduction to Persistence is Resistance, Professor Guy Sheftall wrote, quote, "Feminist scholars must continue to conduct research and generate data to inform public policy debates and decision-making that will affect women and families in the U.S. and around the globe." Abrams, a graduate of Spelman College, where Professor Guy Sheftall has been a leader in the field and on the campus since 1971, graciously, and I do mean graciously because it's not like she doesn't have other things to do and is not like really, really busy. So her grace is really genuinely appreciated for making time, and so much going on anyway, but to commit and then this be a night where there's so much going on with the debate, graciously offers the Gender Studies in Georgia keynote address. And by doing so, she is answering the call by Guy Sheftall and the generations of Black women educators who came before her, who built the field of WGSS in general and Black women's studies in particular. Friday's panel tomorrow at 12 noon, Race, Gender, and the Vote, features 3 authors. One, Michelle Duster, who's the great-granddaughter of Ida B. Wells. You have to follow Michelle Duster on Twitter. She's amazing. And who, Duster, like Abrams, is continuing the demand for social justice for all. The other 2 authors, Martha Jones and Carol Anderson, both focus on voting rights and both focus their attention on the work of Abrams in her Fair Fight Action and Fair Count initiatives. When I constructed this dream conference, and I never thought it would happen, but it did, this was it. And I'm grateful for Ms. Abrams and her willingness to lend her voice and let us amplify her voice for this gathering. The person who will be introducing Stacey Abrams is Caroline Jackson. And Caroline is an MA student. This is my second year as department chair, as director at the Institute. And Caroline was just always one of those people. Yes, I'll show up to this. Yes, I'll show up to do that. And so I didn't call for who wants to introduce Stacey Abrams because everybody want to. I really asked Caroline to do that as the person who's been showing up for those tasks that were requested and even unasked. Caroline Jackson is currently a second-year student in the Women's Gender and Sexuality programs at Georgia State University. Her bachelor's degree is in Women's Gender Studies, was obtained from the University of South Florida, Tampa. During her time at USF, she was active in educating students on college sexual assault and organizing on campus against measures that would restrict resources for survivors of violence on campus. While her undergraduate research focused on trans studies and media representation, her work at GSU has taken a different direction under the guidance of Dr. Susan Talbert. And shout out to WGSS, all of the faculty in our department are amazing. Her master's thesis, which is about to enter the proposal defense stage, yay, Caroline, is about the role of affect and discourse in personal narratives of queer disabled sex. Alongside her thesis work and completing her degree, Caroline is enjoying her first semester teaching in Intro to WGSS class and is excited to continue to a PhD program, so Dr. Jackson 2B, to obtain her goal of being a WGSS professor and researcher. God help you, save yourself. Although school takes up most of her time, Caroline loves exploring the city of Atlanta with her partner Joss, cooking and seeing live music in the pre-COVID world back when outside was open. For Caroline, WGSS is truly her home, where she loves to make connections with people who may have a variety of research and personal interest, but can all agree on some fundamental principles regarding gender, sexual, and racial justice. Caroline Jackson.
Thank you so much, Dr. Evans, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you so much for having me do this introduction for the wonderful Stacey Abrams. Before I do that, just to give a little bit more information about really my biggest passion, women's gender and sexuality studies. I learned about the field of WGSS in high school after finding a lot of acceptance in the world of queer and intersectional feminist blogs and YouTubers. And I was so shocked and amazed to learn that I could get a degree in what I still think is some of the coolest knowledge in the world. Of course, right when I started my feminist education at USF, it felt like this veil was being lifted and I was learning all these things that had been hidden to me before. And I was so excited to share that knowledge. I used to call my mom after most of my freshman year lectures and tell her everything I had just learned. And so now, 5 years later, to get the opportunity to teach my first course, working with students and selecting readings for my Intro to WGSS class has really been a rewarding experience. Now more than ever, I really feel like students like myself at the graduate level who are committed to pursuing a whole degree in WGSS, as well as students who are just coming into the field, who are film students and STEM students, but are taking WGSS courses here in Georgia are really benefiting from a WGSS education, where we're connecting the roles of patriarchy and white supremacy and other systematic forces to issues past and present, such as the Black Lives Matter movement, COVID-19, and a variety of global issues. It's been really great to track my own growth in WGSS as a critical thinker and a feminist, and to see some of my own students making those same strides as well. Now, I could keep going on about how much I love gender studies, but I want to get to our main event. So let me tell you a bit about our keynote speaker, Stacey Abrams. Ms. Abrams is a New York Times bestselling author, nonprofit CEO, and political leader. She's the author of 2 books that you saw today, Lead from the Outside and Our Time is Now. After serving for 11 years in the Georgia House of Representatives, 7 as our Democratic leader, in 2018, she became the Democratic nominee for governor of Georgia, winning more votes than any other Democrat in the state's history. She was the first Black woman to become the gubernatorial nominee for a major party in the US, and she was the first Black woman and first Georgian to deliver a response to the State of the Union. After witnessing the gross mismanagement of the 2018 election by the Georgia Secretary of State's office, she took action and launched Fair Fight Action to ensure that every American has a voice in our election system through programs such as Fair Fight 2020, an initiative to fund and train voter protection teams in 20 battleground states. Over the course of her career, she's founded multiple organizations devoted to voting rights, training and hiring young people of color, and tackling social issues at both the state and national levels. And most recently, in 2019, she launched Fair Count to ensure accuracy in the 2020 census, which is incredibly important, as well as the Southern Economic Advancement Project, a public policy initiative to broaden economic power and build equity in the South. It is now my honor, after sharing a few of her outstanding achievements, to present our keynote speaker for the 2020 Gender Studies in Georgia Conference, the phenomenal Stacey Abrams.
Caroline, thank you so much for your very kind introduction. Thank you so much, Stacey Keltner, for getting this all organized. And of course, Dr. Evans, we are so appreciative of your work in making sure this conference happened. I want to thank SUSA for inviting me, and certainly all of the colleges that have come together to ensure that this conversation can happen. You see, I grew up in Mississippi, came of age in Georgia. I was born in Wisconsin, but I'm mostly a daughter of the South. When I was growing up, my parents were working poor. My mom was a college librarian who became the head of the library at the college where she worked, and yet she made less money sometimes than the man who cleaned the college. My father was a shipyard worker, in part because of dyslexia. He went undiagnosed until he was in his 30s because of a segregated school system that just denied his agency and did not believe that someone who could not read was smart enough. Despite that, my dad went on to get a college degree and eventually a master's degree. I start here because I want you to understand the importance of voting in my life. You see, my parents worked hard and did everything they could to build the best life possible and yet they were often prevented from taking full advantage of what we refer to as the American dream. But my parents didn't let that set them back, and they didn't allow it to distract them from their ambitions for their children. Because as young children themselves, my parents understood the importance of the fight. You see, my mom and dad were teenagers in the civil rights movement. At the age of 14, my dad was arrested during Jim Crow for registering Black people to vote in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. My dad was, taken away from a location because he had the audacity to believe that the Constitution, which guaranteed his family the right to vote, that it could be overturned and thwarted by state action. And so my father was arrested. But we tease him because my mom was on the other side of Hattiesburg doing the same work. She was just smart enough not to get caught. And therein lies my ambition. I think of myself as a great intersection of my parents, my father's audacity and my mother's tenacity, and the way they both believed from the moment I was sentient that every single one of us was entitled to the fullness of America's bounty. My parents would protest in the streets. They would make certain that we understood what we were entitled to, and they had no qualms about taking us out to protest. But then my parents also took us with them to vote in every single election. Now, mind you, I'm the second of 6 kids, so we looked like make way for ducklings when we would go to the voting booths with them. But they wanted us to see them in the act of casting their ballots because they wanted us to understand that even if they were being disregarded, even if they were being marginalized, they would not do it to themselves. My mom and dad were what you call super voters. I don't believe they've ever missed an election. And yet I cannot recall a single time a politician knocked on our door. My neighborhood didn't have yard signs, decorating the front yards during election season. If you were living in my community, you didn't know there were elections going on unless you were inside my house, in part because we lived on the poor Black street in the middle class part of town so we could get zoned into the good school. And as I grew up, as my parents took us out not only to protest, but to do service, they would explain to us that the reason they served, the reason they would take us with them to do work at a soup kitchen or a homeless shelter and a youth justice facility was that no matter how little we have, and we would remind them, by the way, the lights are off at home and, we don't have running water. My mom and dad would tell us that no matter how little we had, there was someone with less. Our job was to serve that person. But they also wanted us to understand that the government that we elected to serve us had to be held accountable. Even if we didn't get what we needed, we could never abdicate our responsibility to lift that voice. And so by the time I was 17, I got to Spelman College and I became what is now regarded as a voting rights activist. When I was 17, though, being a voting rights activist was a very different endeavor. My job then at Spelman College, my self-appointed job, was to convince my fellow students to care about voting. I set up my little table in Manley Plaza and would harangue my fellow students very quietly under my breath because I was also very shy to come and sign up to vote. It worked on occasion. Closer we got to an election, the faster and better it got. But for me, the responsibility had been inculcated from my very beginnings. But what I also understood was that the registration of those to vote was about expanding the franchise. You see, I grew up under the protection of the Voting Rights Act. I grew up under the protection of a shield that said that my right to vote was real and inviolate, and that no state should have the authority to prevent me from voting or discourage me from voting. And so when I turned 18 in December of 1991, I was the most excited 18-year-old to go and cast my first vote. Of course, there was no election, so I just went to register. And the following year, I was ready to be involved in the presidential election, the 92 campaign. I had been watching the Gulf War and watching poverty creep into so many more communities. I'd actually been attending city council meetings because I went to Spelman College, this amazing school that sat in the middle of the Atlanta University Center. My older sister was at Agnes Scott College, this beautiful enclave in Decatur. And when Andrea went outside her campus, she saw shops and beautiful verdant areas. But when I walked outside of my campus, there were liquor stores and there were empty bottles, because part of the challenge was the zoning laws that made Andrea's neighborhood look wonderful, disregarded the needs of the neighbors that I had. And so my commitment to voting was about making certain that our community had what it needed. And so I was a kid who went to zoning committee meetings. never got anything that I wanted, but I knew I had to show up. I tell you this story because I want you to understand why my commitment to the Voting Rights Act, why my commitment to voting itself is so deep and indelible. It is because I know what it looks like when it works, and I know what happens when it doesn't. From 1991 through 2013, I have done everything in my power to expand access to the right to vote, believing that the right to vote, when made real change in lives. Because despite the fact that my parents hadn't gotten as far as they wanted, they'd gotten further than almost anyone they knew because they had that right, because they engaged in the franchise, because they understood what could be done. I joined the General Assembly in 2007. I became the Democratic leader in 2010. But in 2013, when the Supreme Court decided that racism was done and that voting rights were fine, what they did was not only eviscerate the one protection that it stood for 50 years, they rolled back the progress of the 26th Amendment, the 15th Amendment, and yes, the 19th Amendment. Because you see, voter suppression has been the law of our land since our beginning. When you think about the Constitution at its inception, it said that Black people were not human, that Native Americans were to be invisible, and women were not mentioned and were intended to be silent. The 15th Amendment made progress by finally acknowledging the humanity of Black men and giving them the right to vote, but Black women were still left out of that second part of the conversation. We had citizenship that did not include participation. The 19th Amendment granted the right to vote to white women, and that is a good thing. And Black women were part of making that so, but it left Black women out of full participation because across the country, and not simply in the South, Black womanhood was not seen as full womanhood, and therefore the 19th Amendment did not fully enfranchise Black women. And if you were Latina, if you were Asian American, then you were being left out entirely. Because as backwards as the Constitution was, we also had this 1790 Naturalization Act, which said that if you were not a white person of good character, you would not be admitted to the United States and could not gain citizenship. And so it was not until 1965 with the Voting Rights Act that we finally had the fullness of citizenship, that ability to participate in elections made real in the United States. And even then, there were some who were still left out. Because as I said, Native Americans were basically made invisible by the Constitution. They weren't granted citizenship until 1924, and they weren't truly granted the right to vote in the entirety of the United States until 1948. And it still took inclusion of states like Arizona and the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act in 1975 for those who spoke English as a second language and those who had been here since before America was a thought to have full access to our Constitution and to participation in our elections. And so voter suppression is embedded in our DNA. It has been part of the architecture that has built our nation. And I stand here today, or sit here in front of you today, because I know that voter suppression didn't end with the Voting Rights Act. It was simply abated. And when it was abated, it gave women in particular an opportunity to be heard in ways that had never happened before. When women of all races were finally included in participation in our nation, we saw dramatic changes. We saw expansion of access, addressing critical community issues. And the more women spoke up, the more we saw change happen. Progress with a small p is about making certain that more and more have access to opportunity and fewer are denied their participation. And we saw that happen under the penumbra of the Voting Rights Act until 2013. And with 2013, with the evisceration of the Voting Rights Act with the Shelby decision, this was not simply a setback for voting rights. It in particular was a setback for women of color, and for those whose intersectionalities are often elided and ignored by our voting laws. Because you see, 27% of polling places in America are not accessible because they are not ADA compliant. If you are gender nonconforming, your difficulty in registering to vote became even harder in 2013 because any protections that would have forced your inclusion were removed, and it became an option for those states that wanted to deny you access. Because let's be clear, there is no constitutional right to vote. What the 15th Amendment did, what the 19th Amendment did, what the 26th Amendment did for young people was to say that these are reasons you can't be denied the right to vote, but there has never been an affirmative right to vote embedded in the Constitution. But there has always been the right for states to administer elections, which means states have always had the right to decide who they considered worthy of full citizenship. And so my work in voting rights from the age of 17 till the age of 40 was about expanding the right to vote. But in 2013, my fight became very different. And it was a fight to protect the right to vote. I protected it first by starting the New Georgia Project because voter registration is the point of entry for access to the right to vote in the United States. And I continued it when I decided on a whim to run for governor of the state of Georgia. When I stood for governor by centering communities of color, by centering the marginalized and the disadvantaged, by acknowledging those who had so often been left out of the conversation of progress. And I did so intentionally not to exclude others, but to recognize that inclusion has to be intentional. It has to be authoritative, and it has to begin with those who say they wish to lead. And as a woman of color, I had no choice but to be declarative in my belief that we should all be allowed, if we were eligible to vote in the United States, that our votes should be cast and our votes should be counted. Because the architecture of voter suppression, despite its longevity, has never truly changed. Fundamentally, voter suppression is a question of whether you are being prevented from voting or discouraged from voting. But the way it is implemented has always been the same. One, can you register and stay on the rolls? And we know that the registration issues in the United States, particularly here in Georgia, have been aggressive and egregious. We know that when they held hostage 53,000 voter applications in 2018, 53,000 people who were told that their right to vote was dependent on whether or not someone accurately typed in their information. While it was disproportionately affecting communities of color, 80% of those held hostage were people of color. It also disproportionately affected women because women tend to have the challenge of changing their last names, and they were often pushed off of the rolls, not because they weren't eligible, but because they were not considered real enough for those who have responsibility for making their votes right. So can you register and can you stay on the rolls? Voter purging, which happens unfortunately too often in 44 states, purging people from the rolls for failure to vote is amoral and antithetical to the nature of what it means to be in a democracy. It is the only right that you can lose for not using it. When I don't go hunting on Saturday, no one comes for my Second Amendment right. And when I forget to go to church on Sunday, no one says I've lost my right to my freedom of religion. But when someone decides not to vote, they lose that right. And this is incredibly important for women because women often have transitory lives where they may not be in the apartment they were in before, where divorce or domestic violence means that they cannot show up in every space and they may not have access to information. And the fact that they can lose their right to vote when 85% of those involved in domestic violence are women is a wrong, because we are telling women that their voices do not matter simply because their position in society is less stable than we would like. But the second issue, first is can you register and stay on the rolls? The second is can you cast your ballot? Casting your ballot sounds easy, unless you live in a state with strict voter ID. Because for a lot of women in particular, strict voter ID, 90% of women have a challenge with the names that they use when they try to get those IDs. If you get married, God help you. And so we know that women face incredible challenges to voter ID. But we also know that those who are gender nonconforming have a difficulty getting an ID that meets those strict standards, because often those strict standards require that you use the gender that was assigned at birth, assuming you can get access to your birth certificate. And so the notion that voter ID is this non-entity, that it's just the right thing to do, is completely bollocks. Because we know that every state has always required some form of ID. What is being done in the last 20 years has been a strict list of identifications that can be used. And those identifications have been surgically targeted to remove people from the rolls who are considered not quite valuable enough. Can you cast your ballot? Because the second part is there a place to go? Can you go to a polling place? As I mentioned, 27% of polling places are non-ADA compliant. And that means that if you are a person who has a disability that is physical in nature, you may not be able to participate in an election despite your best wishes. And we have to think about how those intersectionalities change the outcome of elections. Can you cast your ballot? In the age of COVID-19, in the age of a pandemic, the fight that we have waged across this country to ensure that you can vote by mail without an excuse has been an onerous one. But in this place, we have been more successful. In January 2020, there were 34 states that let you vote by mail with no excuse. As of today, there are 45 states that let you vote with no excuse or to use COVID as an excuse. But the 5 states that still put this burden on others, those 5 states are being allowed to indulge in voter suppression in ways that should not be allowed in the United States. Can you register and stay on the rolls? Can you cast a ballot? And then does your ballot get counted? Once again, gender plays an unfortunate role because often when you are signing that absentee ballot, the acceptance or rejection of that ballot will depend on whether or not someone believes your signature is fair and accurate. Even though we know your signature changes over time, it changes under stress, it changes based on what you're using to sign with. My signature doesn't match from CVS to Kroger, and yet it can be used as a justification for denying my ability to participate in an election. And for women in particular, because of our name changes, those abilities to reject our ballots are heightened. And when you layer on race and zip code, it becomes a very direct correlation between who is considered a participant in our society and who is denied agency. But I'm not here just to give you bad news, because you see, I believe in the 19th Amendment, the 15th Amendment, the 26th Amendment. But in this moment of the 19th Amendment, I believe in what it promised, because it said that we were not going to be denied. And what has been so incredible in our nation is that women have believed that promise, certainly in the 20th and 21st centuries. Because what we have done is we are half of the nation's population, but we are more than half of the nation's voters. And in every single community, when women step up, things begin to change. And that remains true when it comes to the fight against voter suppression. But we have to be intentional in this moment, because the threat of voter suppression is not declining, it is increasing. I want to be very clear, this isn't a partisan rant, because if you look at the history of our nation, the Whigs engaged in voter suppression, the Democrats did it, and the current moment has largely been done by the Republicans, but it doesn't matter who the architect is. What matters is who's held hostage by their actions, and women, we must be committed together in our dedication to the eradication once and for all of voter suppression in our nation. And we can do this in this upcoming election. We can intentionally elect people who believe that access to democracy belongs to every eligible citizen, and we can reject anyone who would seek to limit that access. We can demand that our voices be included, and we can hold up the banner of democracy as the banner we all can stand under. We can demand automatic registration, so those who are gender nonconforming, those who are facing those challenges are no longer pushed outside the conversation. We can make certain that your zip code and your language are no longer barriers to your participation, that you can speak your language and you can still be able to participate in our elections, because if you are an American, you are an American. And we can do the work of same-day registration, of ensuring equitable resources so no one stands in 3, 4, 7, 12-hour lines to cast a ballot. Because we cannot allow people to distract us with the notion of enthusiasm when what is truly happening is systemic inequity, and it is wrong in elections. It is wrong every time. But more than anything, we can focus our sights on progress. We can vote in this age of COVID-19 to support the women who are the frontline workers, who are those caregivers, who are the nurses, who are the ones who are bearing the brunt of COVID-19 and who are carrying families every single day, hoping that relief is in sight. Relief only comes when our democracy works. And our democracy only works when we work it. And so I'm here today to answer some questions, but I want to leave you with this thought. When I was 17, my job, my self-appointed job, was to sign up my fellow students to register to vote. When I was 45, I decided to stand for public office, and I ran and became the first Black woman in American history to ever win a nomination to be the major party nominee for governor in a state. And when 54,723 votes separated me from success, my responsibility was not to wallow in the past history and the very recent history of voter suppression, but to redouble my efforts to fight to protect the right to vote. I chose not to challenge the election on its face, because the minute that is my choice, I make it all about me. I was raised to believe that my job is to fix things not just for myself, but for those who do not understand or do not have access to the platforms that I can reach. And so when I did my non-concession speech, when I said that I refused to concede that the system that would disenfranchise and silence Georgians was right, it was not about winning an election. I'm not entitled to victory, but I am entitled to a voice, and so is everyone else in our nation who holds citizenship. And if we believe that to be true, if we are to celebrate the 19th Amendment, then we have to celebrate our responsibility every day and in every way to make the right to vote real in the United States. Thank you so much.
Outstanding. I had the pleasure of sharing a stage with you in March before the shutdown. And here I am shuffling my notes, and and she's just like off top, just amazing. And I really appreciate your conviction and your recall, your ability to do this. But I want to ask a question while everyone is populating their. You can ask your questions in the chat. Make sure that you are in the stage chat. So hit stage and chat, not in the event, or because that we won't see that. But while we're waiting for a question, I will take a point of privilege and ask a question about identity politics. When I was reading Our Time Is Now, I was pleasantly surprised, not really surprised, about your explicit reference to identity politics and the Combahee River Collective in particular. And so as I'm teaching feminist theories this semester, so we are looking at identity politics and Barbara Smith and the Combahee River Collective agenda. But I think what's important about what you're doing is that it's not enough. Identity politics is not simply about representation. Right, that I am a Black woman leader, therefore I think this way. Right, identity politics has to do with an agenda, and that you have a very clear agenda. So, and looking at the book, you have a playbook, right? And you say, let's see, your recommendations are: make voting a national holiday, give paid time off to vote, get rid of the Electoral College. Pursue unlikely voters, not just elusive swing voters, reject zero-sum strategy of abandoning voters, voters of color to appease white voters, and encourage people to run as they are, educate, agitate, and activate. And so that's an agenda. That's not like vague. That's it's like, I was like, oh my goodness. And I think the importance of identity politics is very clear now, because we have people who are saying here and abroad that ideas like identity politics, like intersectionality, like critical race research should be outlawed. And I think that is some sort of idea, right, about the importance and the power of ideas. So if you could, can you talk a little bit about identity politics and how and why that reference came in to your work, and then we'll move to questions in the chat box.
Sure. So in Our Time Is Now, I dedicate an entire chapter to identity politics. Part of the decision to include that chapter came out of an article I wrote in response to an article from Francis Fukuyama in Foreign Affairs, where he decried identity politics as a way to weaken democratic progress. I vehemently disagreed and did so in print. And his response, I think, was intentionally misdirected. But here's the thing. We have never not had identity politics. And your reference to those who are now seeking to strip away access, it's because they don't like the identities that now access their politics. They do not like the fact that we no longer have these single strand, or worse, these vague notions of identity that provide protection for some and exclusion of others. Being a white male has been an identity that has been directly connected to politics from the beginning of our country. And let's be clear, even in that identity, there was an exclusion made of those who were not wealthy enough to own land. So 6% of American men, so 6% of Americans could vote in the very first elections, but only white landowning men could participate. And so even then, the single strand identity about being a white guy was not enough. You had to be white, you had to be male, and you had to own property. And so when you fast forward to the incredibly diverse nation that we have today, and the education and the academic rigor that's being applied to understanding both the qualities of those identities, but also the challenges to those identities, making those identities more vibrant and engaged, it is an absolute threat to those who would prefer the more reductive and limited access points that they were used to. I reject that notion. And more importantly, I reject those who would hide from it, fearing that if we lift up the banner of the multiplicity of identities that exist in our communities, we somehow weaken our ability to be successful. And so when I hear those who share my political identity saying, well, we shouldn't use that language, I become very hostile in a very polite way, because that hostility is driven by this notion that by denying who I am, you somehow engage your better success. And the reality is, if you have to deny who I am to achieve your success, I'm probably not included in your success. As a Black woman who understands the origins of the 19th Amendment, I recognize that the moment white women decided that Black women were a hindrance and were pushed to the back of marches and the back of the conversation, the denial of suffrage to that population became so much more salient and more accepted. And so I lift up the banner of identity politics and the determination that we should pursue it robustly, aggressively, and loudly, because if you do not demand your inclusion in a conversation, you will not only be left out of the conversation, you will be left out of the solutions.
Yes. We do have other questions. Thank you so much. I have to give my shout out to Barbara Smith. Okay, so we have a question from Trevor Melton. Would you define yourself as an intersectional feminist?
I would also define myself as a womanist, because I think it's always critical to understand, particularly for women of color, specifically for Black women, that gender does require intersectionality. Feminism does as well. And there are strains of, or I would say there are conversations that have to be had that are specific to your experiences, which is not to exclude the necessity of other conversations, but absolutely demands the intentionality of who I am and where I stand. And so, yes, intersectional feminist, but also a womanist.
Yes. Shout out to Layli Maparian. Alice Walker, of course. Second question, and I think we've got enough questions in the chat, so we'll go with what we have. From Michelle Duster, the great-granddaughter of Ida B. Wells, who will be on our plenary session tomorrow. Her question: what are your thoughts about former felons and or currently incarcerated people having the opportunity to vote?
You live in Maine and Vermont, you can vote no matter what your stage of incarceration. You can vote from jail, you can vote from prison, you can vote from home. I believe that should be the law of the land. We know that most carceral notions of who can vote came about because of slavery, and the notion that if you used enslavement as a justification, if you used imprisonment as a justification for continuing the nature of enslavement, but also to diminish participation post-incarceration. We know that Florida was the state that made it the hardest in 1868, but that states followed with rapidity because they saw an opportunity to gain access to labor and to deny franchise. And so, yes, I fundamentally believe that your state of incarceration should not impact your right to vote. And I say this as someone who has a younger brother who's been in and out of the carceral system. And if he doesn't currently live in the South, but if he ever comes home, he cannot participate in elections. And the fact that his tax dollars are sufficient for his participation, but his fundamental citizenship is no longer worth what he puts in, is just anathema to who we say we are as Americans.
Thank you. I really feel like your work is a legal primer, because in the book you go through not only the 19th Amendment and the 15th Amendment, but the 26th Amendment, and all of these. It's very helpful to understand voting. And this next question is informed by that. When we first met, and I said I didn't vote until I was 28 because I was working. I didn't care. It was like, pick one, it doesn't matter. And I didn't grow up in a very political family. And my first vote was for Marsha Fineland of the Peace and Freedom Party, who I found out later was like on the ballot in California. And you're like, how'd that work out for you? Because you do have to be mindful of all of the politics of voting. So this kind of speaks to this next question from Annalise Cameron. For those who think, why vote? My vote doesn't really matter. What words would you have for them?
I would start by acknowledging the legitimacy of their concern, because if you've grown up in intergenerational poverty, if you know that you lose your right to vote if you are incarcerated, and you live in a state like Georgia where nearly half of the men in this state are on some form of parole or probation. Sorry, maybe it's not half, but we have the highest ratio in the nation and the highest raw number. When you know that there are intentions to diminish your ability to vote or to diminish the effectiveness of your vote, if you live in Florida and you voted on Amendment 4 and you watched it be overturned by the governor and the state legislature, despite 65% of the state saying this is what we want, then yes, you are justified in your skepticism about voting. And so we have to start by acknowledging that people aren't wrong. But we then have to explain how to make it right. And that's where I step in. I believe that we have to explain voting isn't magic. A vote does not change the world. And electing a really good person does not make everything else fall in the line. We don't elect saviors in this country. We elect workers, people we hire to do a job. But there is no job in the world where we think that people will do their job just because we ask them to, and we don't have to hold them accountable. And in politics, so often we hire them in an election and we don't show up again for a few years. And so I talk about voting as a process. Your vote matters when you use it again and again and again. It's like any instrument you learn to play or a sport you engage in, anything you like to do, you get better at it the more you do it, but you also get more successful at it the more people who participate in it. And so, yes, your vote matters because we need your voice to be added to ours. We have reached an inflection point in our nation where those of us of goodwill and good intention have enough in terms of raw numbers that if we applied ourselves, we could see the change we needed. And that has not always been true. I remember in 1992, when I was concerned about poverty and justice in the wake of Rodney King, by the time we got to November, no one was talking about it because there weren't enough of us who were engaged, who paid attention. But this year is completely different. And that is a proof point, because there are more of us who understand this issue, more of us willing to speak up about it, and therefore more of us who can vote about it. Your vote matters because your voice matters, and because winning an election is not strategy, it is not alchemy, it is math. Your vote matters because when you add it to the votes of others, things change. And when you keep it to yourself, things not only stay the same, they sometimes get worse, because those who oppose your values don't just sit home hoping they win. They get out there and they make certain they vote, and they bring the people along with them to vote. And so if we want change to happen, then we have to be as intentional about the continued application of our voices as they are about theirs. Your voice matters because if it didn't, they wouldn't work so hard to stop you.
Indeed. 3 questions left and we're on time. Like, wow. And I'm so mindful of your time anyway, but, I know you have other things to do to prepare for this evening, but 3 questions. One from Roberto Ortiz, he, him. Do you have any tips to organize more efficiently in non-English speaking communities?
Number one, in every facet of my political career, and actually in my business career, but in politics in particular, it is critical to begin in community and ask those in community to help you. The parachuting in does not work. Hiring some very well-intentioned folks who don't speak a language and don't understand the cultural nuances, it cannot be successful. You might get some small moments of ingress, but overall, it's not a successful strategy. So the first tip is to make certain you have people from within the community who are trained to work in that community. And often it's about demanding campaigns pay people for that work. If you are willing to hire someone to help you fundraise, you should be willing to hire someone to help you reach into communities that need access. Number two, it's about deepening that relationship. It is insufficient to go into a community for a single election. We have to go into community for development overall and for engagement overall. And so one of the most efficient ways to do it is to, when you reach into a community that is non-English speaking, to have the first conversation be not about what you need from them, but what they need from you. What do they need? What are their concerns? What are the impediments to their success? And then work from that stage to figure out how you can help. Because the most effective way to organize a community is to demonstrate the connection between voting and outcomes, or if these are non-voting populations, to connect them to what they are entitled to ask for and who can help. The third thing is to constantly ask the question, are we doing enough? Organizing sometimes feels like, oh, I'm coming in to help you. No, you're coming in to ask for help. And you're asking for help by saying to the people that you're supporting, here's what you need. Let me figure out how I can assist you, because when you do better, we do better. And so the constant reevaluation that we have to do is often left out. There's a sense of, let me pat myself on the back, as opposed to, let me check my work and let me make certain I'm doing what I think I'm doing. Let me go back in and talk to the people who are the most skeptical to find out if their skepticism has shifted or not. That kind of work, that kind of engagement is the most efficient. But we have to remember that none of these things are instantaneous, because typically people from non-English speaking countries have had darker experiences with democracy. And therefore their skepticism is deeply embedded, and their cultural heritage doesn't necessarily suggest participation is a good. In fact, it can be dangerous. And we have to be willing to understand that and engage that in order to be successful.
Absolutely. And before the last two questions, I want to take this time to plug, we have a Georgia Voters Workshop that will be held tomorrow. We're screening the film Suppressed. And right after that, at 5 o'clock, we are having a discussion about these very issues, about how to organize, how to become more involved. And someone from Georgia PERG, a GSU undergraduate student, from the Student Advisory Board, and Black Voters Matter, the state representative. Shout out to Latosha Brown, the blackest bus in America, traversing back and forth. And they have a pact, that you need to bring 5 friends to the polls. So there's 500 people registered for this conference. Y'all my friends. So go to the polls and vote. Caroline Jackson had a question, and then we'll close out with one final question.
Okay.
Thank you so much for letting me ask a question that I had. And it was touched on a little bit with the idea of a vote not counting. But I have a different part of that question I'd like to ask, because I hear so many people, especially young people that voted in the last election and did go out to vote for the nominee of their choice, which in my case, I'm talking about the Democratic nominee for president. And after learning about the Electoral College and how that system works, I know a lot of people who feel very frustrated. I feel like we did show up to vote. We did show up to make our voices heard. And then all of a sudden, everything changed overnight, right? So I'd just love to ask you your thoughts on the Electoral College, whether as a political leader you think that is something that could change or should change, or if there's a different way to get our voices heard, essentially.
The Electoral College is racist, it's classist, and that was intentional. The Electoral College was created at the same time using the same premise that created the 3/5 compromise for Congress. It was an accommodation of the South who wanted to count the bodies of Blacks who were enslaved, but did not want to consider their humanity or grant them any actual participation. And so the same way we apportioned power based on population, they did the same for the Electoral College, because they wanted to be able to count the bodies of Blacks, but not their souls for the purposes of the South. But in this case, they were also met by the North, largely white, they were very concerned about other white immigrants that they considered not quite enough. And that goes back to the issue of non-landholding white men being able to vote. The notion was, we want to count them, but we don't really think they're going to do a good job of picking the leadership. And so they didn't want white immigrants that they considered inferior to actually have a voice in who the chief executive of the nation were going to be. So you had this happy compromise between the two, the Electoral College. It is racist, it is classist, it is obsolete. However, it will not go anywhere until we have 2/3 majorities in the House and the Senate and we can get a constitutional amendment. I'm not holding my breath for that. In lieu of that, there is something called the National Popular Vote Movement that I actually introduced legislation for in Georgia. We have states across the country that are considering it. Once we get 270 votes from across the country, where those states agree that no matter who wins their state, whoever wins the national popular vote will get their Electoral College votes. That will then allow us to achieve the goals of national popular vote while acknowledging the continued and persistent existence of the Electoral College. But the Electoral College only affects the presidency. And while this has been a waking nightmare, we have to remember that we've got to vote all the way down the ballot. And the Electoral College affects one job. But the closer you get to the bottom of the ballot, the closer you get to the things that actually affect your life every single day. And so I urge people to be angry about the Electoral College, but be certain that you don't let that distract you from all of the other things. The Electoral College would not have saved George Floyd's life. The Electoral College had nothing to do with the murder of Breonna Taylor. The Electoral College is not the reason that Ahmaud Arbery, his death went unavenged and unacknowledged for 74 days. Those were all things further down the ballot where the popular vote made the choice about who the DA was, who the Attorney General was, who the judges are. And we have to be certain that we don't get so fixated on the presidency, although please go vote for Joe Biden, that we don't become so fixated on the unfairness of the Electoral College that we forget the power we have as we go further down the ballot and we get closer to the things that change our lives.
Thank you. I really appreciate that.
Absolutely.
Great question, Caroline. Okay, last question from Bridget Bailey. And this is one that is definitely close to my heart because I do Black women's intellectual history, but in the last few years, I moved toward mental health because the stress that everyone is going through right now is ridiculous. And after the 2016 election, the American Psychological Association, which does an annual stress report, noted that it has skyrocketed. And then just in May came out with the 2020 report. And of course, because of COVID and the protests and another election year, stress is through the roof. So this question for you is from Bridget Bailey. I am an undergrad. Every day as a WGSS major, we talk about the issues we face daily. We expand on them and dissect them. How did you, and did you as an undergrad, how do you keep going when you are feeling burnout? Or how do you pick yourself up? Because we need a sustained and sustainable struggle. And you are in the struggle, but how do you keep going?
So I want to acknowledge for a moment, my older sister, Andrea Abrams, Dr. Andrea Abrams is a women's studies. She holds a certificate in women's studies. She's the vice president of diversity at Centre College. And part of her job is helping undergrads navigate this in this moment. One thing that Andrea and I share in common, she's my older sister. We love to read. We have this shared library with my other siblings. We actually have a sibling book club. I told you there's 6 of us. And I start there because part of the way we burn out is we become so insular in our pain that we forget to remember our successes and our joys. There is nothing noble about being focused on the darkness. It doesn't help you. It doesn't help others. And what it can do is collapse the architecture of your soul. So you aren't capable of sustaining what you need to do. And so I let myself have joy. Sometimes it's the small joy of watching a television show that I like. Sometimes it's reading a romance novel I've read 10 times before, but I know when I get in there, I'm going to be incredibly happy. And I know the arguments they're going to have. I know the moment they're going to possibly break up. I know that I'm going to feel this catch in my breath when he finally realizes he should have listened to her all along. And it's worth it for me. And so find your small joys and give yourself permission to experience them. Sometimes we think that the badge of honor is our pain. Pain is what the price we pay, but the badge of honor is our sustainability. And so I let myself feel joy, but I also let myself feel the pain, because the opposite end are those who will just let themselves steep in the pain. And then there are those who refuse to acknowledge it exists. November 16th, 2018 was the 10th day. On November 6th, 2018, I spent 10 days going through the stages of grief in public. I was the most Googled person in the world in politics. And I had publicly not succeeded at something that no one had done before, which meant I didn't do it either. There is a searing pain that comes with that. There is a grief that wells up still. And when I was in college, it wasn't quite that acute, but there were moments that were so dark and sad that I could have wallowed. But my responsibility is to acknowledge my pain and then seek not just counsel, but seek succor. Find people who love you and will listen to you. Don't do it every day because they're going to get tired too. But make sure you have a respite, that you have people that you can just go to and just sit in silence with or weep with without having to explain the legitimacy of your tears. And this is for everyone on this. We deserve to feel pain. We deserve to feel depression. We deserve to feel grief. But we also deserve to feel joy. We deserve to be enraged, and we deserve the fight. And so I restore myself by letting myself watch TV, read a good book, disconnect, because I know it'll still be there when I get back, and I will be better for everyone if I come back strong.
Excellent. Thank you so much. That's helpful. I was just kind of yes, because this is hard work. As I started off this conference, like none of this is normal and it's all horrible. That's not hyperbole. This world is a dumpster fire and that's where we are. But to be able to do this work, I mean, already on the first day, and again, thank you so much, Stacey Keltner, for making sure that we were able to hold this. And thank you, Stacey Abrams. I am reviewing the book. I know that it's past time, so Stacey Abrams, if you would like to, to bow out. Thank you so much.
And a shout out. I just have to shout out very quickly to Beverly Guy Shefdahl. I never got to take her classes, but I learned so much from her. I was afraid of her as a professor, but she's an awesome, awesome, awesome mind. Love you guys. Take care. Thank you.
So to close out, I just really appreciate the time that is taken that Stacey Abrams took to bring us together. But really, this is about us being together. And so I want to thank you so much, Stacey Keltner, and thank you, Caroline, for humoring me when I was like, guess what? Because this is what our job is. I think of myself as an intellectual organizer, and I'm never the smartest person in the room. And if I ever get to a point where I think I'm the smartest person in the room, I go to a different room. And so this is what it means to be an amplifier. And so I'm actually reviewing Our Time Is Now in conversation with the books by Michelle Duster and Martha Jones and Carol Anderson, simply because there is so much power in the slow learning that takes place. And hashtag Cite a Sister, hashtag Cite Black Women, where we come together and we, WGSS, the study of ideas like intersectionality, like Black feminist thought, like critical race studies, seems really abstract and still until someone says, well, we need to outlaw it because it's producing people like Stacey Abrams. And so it is just such an honor and a pleasure to be here and to share this time. As we close out tonight, let me remind you of a couple of things that I will remind you of when I find that here it is. Okay, good. Tomorrow, so this evening we have receptions if there's 4 reception rooms, and they're not going to be long receptions, simply because we've got a lot of stuff to do, and there's a debate tonight for those who need to watch. But at 7 p.m. tonight and tomorrow night. As with any other professional conference, part of conferencing is networking. Now it's time for us to head to the bar and chit chat about everything that we experienced in the panels today. Today we had Georgia State University, Kennesaw, UGA, Spelman, and Valdosta. Tomorrow we'll have Mercer, Perimeter, Georgia Southern, Emory, Agnes Scott, and Clark Atlanta. So if you are interested in attending any of those programs, this is where you go to get some information or just find out what your peers are doing. If you're an undergrad, what are your other, your peers saying? Tomorrow night, we'll have a reception for undergraduate students. So WGSS majors who are undergraduates, Bridget Bailey, right? All of the undergraduate students from around the state and those who are attending from out of the country, because there's 500 people here. There's a reception for WGSS majors to talk. There's a reception for graduate students to talk. There's a reception for faculty and staff to talk, and then community organizations as well. And so I think that is all we have to say. So in this platform, we'll leave the stage now at 7 o'clock. If you look to the left, you'll see reception, stage, sessions, expo. Get in there, walk around, look at the expo. There's some stuff that's in there, including the SUSA's call for papers, right?
Yep.
So this evening, we have the research. If you're interested in research at 7 o'clock, we'll have a session. Graduate school mentoring. If you're an undergraduate student and want to go to graduate school, or a graduate student, we'll talk about how to survive graduate school. Organizing and activism. If you want to figure out how to get active, there's a group that will meet tonight at 7. And then SUSA state meetings. So if you are, this is kind of a model and a grand experiment, as Stacey Keltner likes to call what we're doing with SUSA. So Stacey, would you take just a couple of minutes to talk about SUSA and what we're doing in that state meetings, and then we'll close out.
Sure. Yeah. So for several years, we've tried to get connections across the state going, and we'll have events, and they're wonderful. We want to keep them going, but we found that they haven't been sustainable, right? Because we get sort of bound up in our own lives, and we get busy, and then we sort of lose those important connections. And sometimes you really need those, like during a pandemic, or like when you're being targeted by white supremacists or MRAs. And so we talked about sort of, creating stronger networks. And our hope, when Steffi and I have been talking, and I've been talking with the SUSA board, is that SUSA can provide that kind of structure for us across states. And if this is something that we could develop across states, and we could have this, in the fall, and then all get together, again in the spring at SUSA, that would, create the kind of networks and connections, across our lives in a way that could be incredibly meaningful and useful and beneficial for us. So that's what we'll talk about tonight. If you want to do this in your state, and I've talked to other people in states who they've tried to do it, but it's not been sustained because there's no structure for it. And we hope SUSA can be that, and we can slowly build up to that. So yes, we have an exhibit in the expo area. It has our call for papers. It also has a community survey. And like Stacey Abrams was saying, if you want to do work, then you need to ask the community what they need. And that's precisely what we're trying to do in the survey, is to find out, what does the community think that its regional organizations should be doing, right? What are the community needs? What should SUSA's concept be, its mission, its strategic plan? What kind of programming do you want? We want to provide more year-round programming. So there's an important community survey there too, and we would like for everyone to take it, and we could have an open town hall meeting before the SUSA conference in the spring. But the SUSA CFP is there too. It's due November 15th. It's called Precarious Times, Embodying Disobedience, Crafting Affinities. So I hope you'll join us.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So so this is, if you're an undergraduate or graduate student, some WGSS grad students are already slated to present at SUSA. So now you'll be familiar with the platform, because part of the reason that Stacey agreed to do this was because this will be the platform for SUSA. So now you're already familiar with the conference platform. And so, you'll be a little bit at ease. So join us tomorrow. Well, join us tonight at 7 o'clock in the sessions. if you would like to just network for a few minutes. It won't be long. And then join us tomorrow morning for the incoming president of NWSA, the National Women's Studies Association, Dr. K. Today with Dr. K, Dr. K. Wise Whitehead. We have truly been graced to have this connection, and we really look forward to continuing this discussion. Peace, y'all.